Cindy James was a nurse and counselor in British Columbia. Kind, intelligent, respected. But in 1982, her life turned into a waking nightmare. She told police she was being stalked, harassed, attacked. Her phone rang with threats. Her pets were killed. Her body was found bound and bruised more than once, barely alive. But police never found a suspect. And as the years dragged on, doubt crept in. Was someone tormenting Cindy, or was she staging the attacks herself? Then, in 1989, she vanished. 2 weeks later, her body was found in a stranger's yard. Drugged. Hogtied. Dead. The autopsy? No clear cause. No sign of struggle. And no answers. To this day, her case remains unsolved. Was it suicide? Murder? Mental breakdown? All that remains is the haunting silence. And a question no one can answer. Who killed Cindy James? Cindy James was not the kind of woman you'd expect to become a mystery. She was polished, professional, a trained nurse, a counselor for emotionally troubled children. She smiled often, but not always easily. Her colleagues called her composed. Her patients? They called her kind. For nearly a decade, Cindy worked at Blenheim House, a care facility for youth with psychiatric and behavioral issues. It wasn't easy work. But Cindy had a calmness about her. A patience. A way of making you feel like you were heard, even when no one else was listening. But behind closed doors, she struggled. She married young. Dr. Roy Makepeace, a respected psychiatrist, 17 years her senior. To the outside world, they looked solid. But within a few years, cracks began to show. Friends would later say the marriage became cold. Controlling. Roy was demanding. Cindy grew withdrawn. They separated after 16 years. The divorce came in 1982. But it wasn't clean. Not by a long shot. After the split, Cindy changed. She moved into a new home in Richmond, British Columbia. She began living alone. Quietly. Carefully. She dyed her hair. She adopted a dog. She changed her phone number multiple times. But something else was different. Paranoia crept in. And soon after, something darker. Police records would show her first report of harassment came just months after her divorce. But her anxiety started earlier than that. She confided in friends that someone was watching her. That her phone would ring, and there'd be only silence. That she felt followed. That someone was after her. Many didn't know what to make of it. Some assumed she was fragile after the divorce. Others began to wonder if something was truly wrong. Cindy underwent multiple psychological evaluations over the years. One doctor described her as anxious, vulnerable, and emotionally suppressed. Another mentioned traits consistent with histrionic personality disorder. But none diagnosed her as delusional. None said she was psychotic. And none believed she was a danger to herself. Still, the question lingered. Was Cindy breaking down? Or was something, or someone, breaking her? Neighbors started whispering. Friends began to distance themselves. And the police? They weren't sure what to believe. Because what came next was unlike anything they'd ever seen. The first call came late at night. A soft click. No voice. Just silence. Then another. And another. Cindy told police someone was stalking her. Watching her home. Calling her. But there was no evidence. No fingerprints. No recordings. Nothing to hold on to. She started receiving notes. Jagged handwriting. Messages cut from magazines. Threats that didn't make sense. "You'll die soon," one read. Another simply said, "Meet." Her porch light was smashed. Her phone line severed. Her pillow slashed. At first, it looked like pranks. But the incidents kept coming. And they were getting darker. One morning, she found her dog, nearly strangled by a cord. Then her cat, dead. Tied up in her garden. Someone had slit its throat. She changed her locks. She moved. She painted her car. She told almost no one where she lived. Still, the stalker found her. She'd come home to windows shattered. Curtains shredded. Notes stuffed into her mailbox. Her phone would ring and ring. Heavy breathing on the line. Or a voice, low, distorted. Sometimes it hissed her name. Sometimes it just laughed. She started documenting everything. Journals. Photos. Voice memos. She even tried carrying a recorder in her pocket. But the stalker always slipped through. Like smoke. Like they were one step ahead. Police began watching her home. Some officers believed her. Others didn't. They staked out her house. Watched from parked cars. But the nights they watched, nothing happened. The nights they didn't. Cindy would call, panicked, shaking, injured. She was found once in a ditch, semi-conscious, a nylon stocking tied tight around her neck. Another time, she was discovered inside her garage. Her hands and feet bound. A knife jabbed through her palm. A note pinned to her body. She had no memory of how she got there. Her friends were terrified. Some believed her. Others quietly wondered if she was doing it to herself. A fire broke out in her basement. It had been set deliberately. Cindy claimed she saw someone fleeing the scene, but there were no footprints. No signs of forced entry. No trace of an intruder. The police started to change their tone. They asked her, gently at first, if she'd staged the incidents. She denied it. Repeatedly. Tearfully. She insisted she was being hunted. Still, suspicion crept in. One officer described her as credibly afraid, but possibly unstable. Another thought she had a split between victimhood and control. But Cindy kept insisting someone was doing this to her. Someone real. Someone close. She began to grow more isolated. More paranoid. Her weight dropped. She stopped sleeping. One day, she checked herself into a psychiatric hospital. Voluntarily. She stayed for 10 weeks. When she was released, she wasn't the same. She began wearing wigs. Disguises. She wouldn't drive the same route twice. She kept notes of every conversation, every shadow she saw, every creak in her house. And still, the stalking continued. One night, her close friend Agnes and Agnes's husband came to check on her. They were worried. Cindy had missed a meeting. They walked around the back of the house, and froze. The door was open. Inside, the house was still. Too still. Then they heard her. A faint moan, coming from the garage. They found Cindy collapsed. A nylon stocking wrapped around her neck. She was barely breathing. A needle mark was found on her arm. She had no recollection of how she got there. It was happening again. And again. For 7 years. And still, no suspects. No fingerprints. No names. No arrests. The police grew colder. The public turned skeptical. Even some of her friends backed away. But the events didn't stop. And on May 25, 1989, Cindy James disappeared. Cindy went to the police more than 100 times. She brought them notes. Played them the voicemails. Let them see the cuts on her arms, the bruises on her legs, the stocking still knotted around her throat. And at first, they listened. In 1982, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police opened a file. Officers were dispatched to patrol her home. They questioned neighbors. They examined her phone records. There was real concern. Real urgency. But that didn't last. Because nothing stuck. There were no fingerprints. No usable recordings. No witnesses. Only Cindy. Shaking. Terrified. Repeating the same story. Over time, that sympathy began to erode. Some officers believed she was making it all up. Others didn't say it aloud, but stopped treating her reports with the same weight. They told her she needed rest. That she was under stress. That maybe, just maybe, the danger was in her mind. And the shift was subtle at first. It started with slower response times. Less thorough follow-ups. Then came the closed-door meetings, the whispers, the internal notes that questioned her credibility. When Cindy was found with a cord tied around her neck in her garage, barely conscious, some investigators didn't treat it as an attempted murder. They looked for how she might have staged it herself. When her house caught fire, and she screamed about a man fleeing through the backyard, they noted her lack of a clear description, and began to wonder if the fire had been self-inflicted. The theory grew louder. That Cindy James was orchestrating her own torment. That she craved attention. Or was suffering a breakdown. That maybe all of this, 7 years of terror, was an elaborate cry for help. But that idea, planted and watered by doubt, came with consequences. Surveillance was set up. Twice. But the results were thin. One officer stayed in the basement of her home overnight. Another hid in a car across the street. Nothing happened. And on the nights no one watched, those were the nights she was attacked. Some officers said it was suspicious. Others argued it was calculated. But what they didn't consider, or refused to, was the possibility that someone was watching the watchers. The police said they couldn't protect her 24/7. They didn't have the resources. They urged her to seek psychiatric help. And she did. Again and again. But the threats kept coming. Her friends watched her unravel. Her family grew desperate. And the police? They began documenting her behavior as erratic. They talked about attention-seeking tendencies. Possible self-harm. Psychological fabrication. They never said it outright. But they stopped believing her. And when that happened, the case began to slip. Evidence went uncollected. Calls unreturned. Windows broken and never fingerprinted. Blood left behind and never tested. One officer, years later, admitted, "We weren't sure what we were looking at anymore. A victim? A hoax? A mental breakdown? We didn't know. And maybe we didn't want to know." But whether Cindy staged it or suffered it, she was suffering. And when she disappeared, 2 weeks before her body was found, those same officers scrambled. Suddenly, everything became real again. But by then, it was too late. And the questions they had buried deep beneath skepticism and bureaucracy came roaring back. Before the terror began, there was Roy. Dr. Roy Makepeace. A respected psychiatrist. Older than Cindy by nearly 2 decades. Distinguished. Charismatic. Cold. They had met during her training. He mentored her. Guided her. Married her. On paper, it looked ideal. A young, compassionate nurse. An accomplished doctor. But behind closed doors, it wasn't gentle. There were stories of control. Of silence. Of Cindy becoming someone else under his gaze. Less confident. More nervous. Careful. They divorced in 1982. And that's when the real fear started. The calls. The threats. The shadows outside her window. She told friends she was afraid of him. She told police she suspected Roy knew more than he was saying. Still, she kept in contact. Sometimes she'd call him after a disturbing incident. Sometimes she'd go to his home when she felt unsafe. That confused the investigators. Why go back to a man she feared? But fear is rarely simple. And trauma, even less so. Then came a recording. A voicemail. The voice on the tape was raspy, distorted. It said, "Cindy, dead meat soon." But the message wasn't left on her machine. It was sent to Roy. He gave the tape to police. Said he didn't know who it was. Said he was concerned for her safety. But it only raised more questions. Was it a warning? A threat? A performance? And who would threaten Cindy, through him? Some officers began to look closer at Dr. Makepeace. Not just as an ex-husband, but as a potential suspect. He had motive. He had access. He had knowledge of medications, and how to use them. He knew how to sedate someone. How to manipulate. How to make a person doubt their own mind. But whenever investigators pressed, he stayed polite. Calm. Detached. He submitted to interviews. Answered questions. Always careful. Almost seeming rehearsed. He denied involvement. Said Cindy was unraveling. That he had tried to help her. That maybe she couldn't be helped. But there was one moment, quiet, buried deep in the investigation, that haunted detectives. During a recorded interview, Roy calmly theorized that Cindy was suffering from dissociative identity disorder. He speculated that she might be behind the attacks herself. That her psyche was fractured. That one part of her wanted attention, while the other wanted to die. Coming from a psychiatrist, her former husband, it was chilling. Because he wasn't just offering a theory. He was shaping the narrative. And slowly, that narrative took hold. The more he spoke, the more police believed Cindy might be unstable. The more they saw her as unreliable. Delusional. Hysterical. Meanwhile, Roy stayed distant. Untouched by suspicion. Living in the same city. Watching it all unfold. Some say he was just a bystander. Others believe he was always one step ahead. Shielded by status. Protected by perception. Cindy never publicly accused him. Not directly. But her diary hinted otherwise. There were passages about control, fear and about feeling watched and manipulated. And always, the presence of someone who knew her better than anyone else. Even after death, the police never charged Dr. Roy Makepeace. He moved on. Changed cities. Eventually retired. But his shadow never left the case. And for those who still believe Cindy James was murdered, his name remains etched in the margins. Just out of reach. Just out of frame. The first fire wasn't the last. But it was the one that changed everything. It started in the basement. An unnatural blaze, flaring fast and high. Cindy barely escaped, barefoot, panicked, pounding on her neighbor's door. She was trembling. Smoke on her skin. Her hair scorched. She said she saw someone run. A man. Slipping into the darkness behind her fence. When the fire department arrived, they found accelerants. Carefully placed. Strategically positioned to ignite in a way that would trap her. But there was no forced entry. No broken windows. No signs of how anyone got in, or out. And the worst part? Her phone lines had been cut. She had tried to call for help. But someone made sure she couldn't. The investigators wrote it off. They couldn't prove anyone else was there. Couldn't prove she hadn't said it herself. But Cindy's fear didn't fade. It grew. Soon after, she was found slumped behind the wheel of her car in a shopping mall parking lot. A man walking by saw her. Said her face was bruised. Her hands were tied behind her back with a pair of nylon stockings. A black nylon pulled tight around her throat. She was semi-conscious. Barely breathing. The paramedics said she'd been sedated. But no drugs were found in the car. No syringes. No vials. Just Cindy. Bound and battered. Police couldn't understand it. The knots were too complex. Too tight. They said it would have taken another person, or several, to bind her like that. But again, there were no witnesses. No attackers seen. And no one ever came forward. Months later, it happened again. This time, outside a stranger's house. Cindy was discovered lying in their yard. Shoes missing. Lips split. Her arms tied behind her with a second pair of nylons. A needle mark on her arm. And another black stocking cinched at her throat. She had no memory of how she got there. She said she'd been taken. Beaten. Dumped. She was missing for hours that night. In other incidents, days. Once, she vanished for nearly 72 hours. When she returned, she was disoriented. Her hair was hacked unevenly. Her clothes weren't hers. She said she'd been driven far from Vancouver. Kept in a dark room. Threatened. But police grew colder. Less sympathetic. They asked how she could have tied herself up. How she could have injected herself with tranquilizers. They started documenting the events as self-inflicted. Claimed she had psychiatric issues. That she craved drama. Or attention. But her friends didn't believe that. Neither did her private investigator. He said, there is no way she staged these things. Not all of them. Not with the fear in her eyes. Not with what she endured. The fire. The beatings. The restraints. They were too clean. Too methodical. Too deliberate. And they kept coming. Each one stranger than the last. Each one more public. More humiliating. And still, not a single arrest. Whoever was doing it, if it wasn't Cindy, was slipping through the cracks. Watching. Waiting. Always a step ahead. She told her sister she was terrified. That she didn't think she'd survive much longer. That the next attack would be the last. And soon after, she vanished. Disappeared without a word. Until her body was found. Face down. Hands tied. Stocking around her throat. But that was just the beginning of the end. June 8, 1989. A quiet Thursday in Richmond, British Columbia. Cindy James was running errands. She picked up her paycheck from work. Stopped by the bank. Bought a few groceries. Nothing unusual. Nothing alarming. She was dressed casually. Calm. Still afraid, but always careful. She had plans to meet friends for dinner that night. But she never showed. Her car was found hours later in the parking lot of a nearby shopping center. The groceries were still in the back seat. Milk. Bread. Fresh fruit. The doors were unlocked. Keys missing. But the real story was written in the silence. On the driver's side door, a small blood smear. On the ground, her wallet. And just beneath the car, a single, discarded nylon stocking. No one saw her leave. No one saw her taken. No surveillance footage. No sound. She had vanished. Her family feared the worst. Her sister said Cindy would never leave her cat behind. Never miss a dinner. Never abandon her car. But the police hesitated. Again. Some officers assumed it was another staged event. Another act in what they believed was an unraveling mind. For 2 weeks, they waited. Then, on June 25th, a shocking discovery. In the backyard of a quiet suburban home, just a mile from where her car had been left, 2 men stumbled upon a body. Hidden in tall grass. Face down. Shoes missing. It was Cindy. Her hands and feet were tied behind her back. A black nylon stocking wrapped tightly around her neck. She had been hogtied. And left out there, exposed to the elements. 4 days. But there was something even more disturbing. The autopsy revealed high levels of morphine and flurazepam in her system. Enough to sedate her. Possibly even kill her. Yet there were no defensive wounds. No signs of struggle. Just stillness. The binding was complex. knotted tightly. Police immediately questioned how she could have done it to herself. Hogtied. Drugged. Hidden in someone else's yard. It didn't make sense. Not to investigators. Not to doctors. Not to anyone who'd followed the case this far. Her family was devastated. Her private investigator furious. Her ex-husband silent. Some wanted to call it suicide. Others screamed murder. But whatever happened that day, one thing was clear. It was the end of Cindy James' life. But nowhere near the end of her story. And what came next would shake everyone. They laid out the photos. Printed the autopsy. Studied every knot, every inch of cord, every bruised limb. And none of it made sense. Cindy James had been found hogtied. Face down in a backyard, hands and feet pulled behind her like a trussed animal. A nylon stocking wound tightly around her throat. No struggle. No chaos. Just stillness. Forensic analysts got to work. They examined the bindings, multiple loops, taut and layered. Knots cinched tightly, some in positions difficult to reach without help. Not impossible, they said. But incredibly unlikely. To test the theory, investigators brought in experts. Tried to replicate the knot pattern using dolls. Then tried on themselves. Even the most flexible among them failed. Not cleanly. Not while sedated. Because here's the catch. The toxicology report showed lethal doses of morphine in her system. And flurazepam, a sedative. Enough to dull her senses. Enough to put her under completely. Experts agreed, once the drugs kicked in, she'd barely be able to stay awake. Let alone tie herself in complex, multi-step restraints. Some argued she could have taken the drugs first, then rushed to bind herself in the final minutes. But morphine doesn't wait. The window is short. Measured in moments. And the dosage in her system. It would have knocked her out almost immediately. The scene was clean. Too clean. There were no fingerprints. Not on the twine. Not on the stocking. Not even on her own skin, beyond the obvious. No DNA. No hair fibers. No blood. No trace of a second person. But also, no trace of her walking there. The backyard grass was undisturbed. No footprints in the soil. No drag marks. No sign she had arrived on foot, or been carried in. So how did she get there? And how long had she been there before they found her? Some theorized she died elsewhere, and was later dumped. But again, no fibers, no vehicle marks, no evidence of transport. A forensic paradox. A riddle in knots and needles. Her body told one story. The scene told another. And the clock kept ticking. Was it suicide, staged to look like murder? Murder, staged to look like suicide? Or something in between, something darker? The experts were divided. The police were conflicted. And the truth slipped further from reach. But one thing was becoming disturbingly clear. Whoever was behind Cindy James' death, if it wasn't Cindy herself, knew exactly what they were doing. And the questions that haunted her life were only multiplying in death. 7 years. Dozens of attacks. Over 100 police reports. And a woman found dead under circumstances no one could explain. Cindy James was either the victim of an invisible monster, or the architect of her own terrifying end. The official cause of death? Undetermined. But the theories, they came fast. Loud. Divisive. Some believed it was suicide. A meticulously staged, final cry for help. The drugs, the bindings, the location, all part of a plan. Not to escape life quietly, but to leave a mark. To prove how far she'd been pushed. But there was a problem with that version. Too many problems. The knots. Too intricate. The drugs. Too powerful. The timing. Too tight. Cindy would have had minutes. Maybe less. Barely enough time to think. Let alone tie herself into a hogtied position and stage a clean scene. So others turned to murder. The stalker she always spoke of. The voice in the calls. The shadow in the window. Someone who tormented her, watched her, knew her routine inside and out. Someone who enjoyed the long game. If that's true, they played it flawlessly. No fingerprints. No mistakes. 7 years. And not once did they slip. Then there's the theory few wanted to say out loud. That Cindy broke. That the fear twisted something inside her. A mental break. Not overnight, but slowly, piece by piece. The trauma layering itself into delusion. The fear creating its own predator. There were whispers. Doctors who questioned her stability. Family who saw her drift. But if that's true, how did she tie herself like that? Why the drugs? Why the secrecy? Why the silence? Some believed revenge was the motive. A patient. A lover. A stranger she tried to help once, who turned against her. Or someone from her past she never mentioned. A loose thread she never tied up. Others whispered conspiracy. Something bigger. Institutional. A cover-up. An insider with power, someone who knew how to erase footprints and fingerprints. Someone who knew which doors to close. And when to close them. But the deeper the theories go, the harder it is to find solid ground. Everyone had a piece of Cindy's story. But no one had the whole picture. She died surrounded by questions. And decades later, those questions still hang in the air. Unanswered. Unresolved. Waiting. Because if this wasn't suicide, and it wasn't madness, and it wasn't just another unsolved murder, then what was it? And who is still watching? At first, the media treated her like a victim. A nurse. A counselor. A woman under siege. She was terrified. And that terror made headlines. Local woman stalked. Police baffled by mysterious attacks. Her story was splashed across newspapers, discussed on radio. A woman haunted by an invisible predator. The public rallied behind her. But that sympathy didn't last. As the years dragged on and the attacks continued, questions crept in. Why was there never any solid evidence? Why did it always happen when no one was watching? Journalists started to dig deeper. Not into the attacker, but into Cindy. The narrative shifted. The tone hardened. Victim or fabricator? Real threat or psychological spiral? Reporters began calling her troubled. Her mental health became the story. Old records resurfaced. Her divorce from Dr. Roy Makepeace. Psychiatric evaluations. Whispers of trauma. Rumors of instability. The public followed the lead. Some still stood by her. Neighbors. Friends. People who saw the bruises, the fear in her eyes. But others started to doubt. The phone calls that couldn't be traced. The break-ins with no signs of forced entry. The staged feel of the crime scenes. Each new incident seemed more dramatic than the last. And the headlines fed the frenzy. When she was found dead, bound, drugged, discarded, the press erupted. Some called it tragic. Others called it inevitable. Was it the climax of a horrific campaign of abuse? Or the final act in a long, elaborate performance? Talk shows debated it. Opinion pieces took sides. And her name became shorthand for something darker. A mystery. A warning. A woman either not believed, or not believable. In the years that followed, Cindy James remained a symbol. Of failed investigations. Of misunderstood trauma. Of how a narrative can shift in the public eye, from helpless victim to unreliable narrator. She became a case study in criminology courses. A segment on late-night mystery specials. An unsolved headline that refused to fade. And still, no one could agree on what really happened to her. Not the police. Not the press. Not the public. Because Cindy didn't just vanish into death. She dissolved into speculation. And that speculation only grows louder with time. The file is still open. But the case is cold. Cindy James was found hogtied. Injected with massive doses of morphine and flurazepam. Dumped behind an abandoned house. Yet, to this day, the official cause of death reads, unknown. Not homicide. Not suicide. Just a void. A question mark. The story didn't end with her death. If anything, it grew louder. More tangled. Her family never stopped fighting. They begged the authorities to look again. To take her seriously. To treat her as a victim, not a puzzle. But time kept moving. And the case slipped from headlines into whispers. Into rumors. Into theory after theory. Her sister still speaks out. Still challenges the idea that Cindy could have done all this to herself. Still asks how the system, the police, the media, the public, allowed her to be failed again and again. This wasn't just a mystery. It was a mirror. Reflecting how mental illness is treated. How women in fear are doubted. How a victim can become a suspect when answers don't come quickly enough. The police? They've long since stepped away. No fresh leads. No new evidence. No final word. There was talk, once, of reopening it. Of taking a second look with modern forensics. But it never happened. The will wasn't there. Or maybe, someone didn't want it reopened. To this day, Cindy's story hangs in the air. A ghost. Her name still sparks debates on online forums, in books, on true crime panels. But no one really knows what happened to her. Was she murdered by someone close? Did the trauma twist her mind until she couldn't tell what was real? Or did a killer walk free? While the world watched and did nothing? The truth didn't die with Cindy James. It was buried. And someone, somewhere, might still be holding the shovel.